Pero les recomiendo que bajes de tan cambio porque me importó. Y no estaba hablando de temporero, pero ¿quién como yo? Otra historia donde vuestro pecado después alguien por basta. Me mira mal y me trata como felina, miro de ninguno colgado de 160. Me andé desvinculándome. Tanta situación que está pasando. ¿Qué pasó? Contagios de tu sabor. Y en la noche yo pienso en qué pasó con nosotros. No sabemos. Mire, si tú quieres. ¿Cómo no? Ay, no llame. No sé. ¿Qué le? Sí. No sé. Pero, Perfecto. Te hacen solo la ternura. Sin mis miedos, pero oh shit. Ya. Con nosotros ojitos que me hipnotizan. Ay, que de la cara. De ver tu labio. Pa' conocernos, no bastarnos mirar. La noche, conocerte. El diablo reía. No hay nada. Tu rostro en una estrella. Oh, wait. Mm. No puedo estar aquí. Tu mirada la que sonríe. Y se ve total, ser el pasado de ser que se no merece, pero tú eres ese. Me acuerdo cuando con un solo beso mataba mis penas. Sí, creo que te extraño, aunque eso no perdemos como nos extraño. Te eres engaño. Mm, 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 mm. Te quiero y te respeto. Tu mano mi amorito. Dame ese rock que se tan mal, eso todo tan balear más lento. Mano mía, más que soledad, sin volver cuento. Mi pereza, me marca porque yo está mal. Okay. Shit. Muñeco vudú que lograste lástima. Date agua sin pensar. Arreglar tu mambo. Pero vos sos mala y nunca tuve en toda tu cara. Mi amargura. En esta pena será tu pasión. Será tu paz, también tu armadura. Tienes armadura. Entender por tanta hermosura. Que sincero, me saco el cara. Solitario, el más llano. Desde Sofía, acabé con la idea de llenar un vacío. Ilusión infeliz. Tuve que adaptarme, fuiste el más bellísimo, pero debí soltarme un pájaro. Ya no estás en mi realidad, forzosamente tuve que adaptar. Definiendo que te quiero saber por lo que estudio. No puedo morir por lo que estudio. Aquí, no esto estudio. Quédate. Mm, que-
That was my 7 days journey into learning anatomy, and this is the words of Magoon from China, top character illustrator.
que-
crees? Este tipo de dibujos se logran con la perspectiva. Así que en este video desarrollaremos
Line art is one of those things that
to 2-point perspective. Point. So here I'm going to do a basic square. That's as good of a square as I can get. So what's going to happen is I'm going to connect all the corners of the square back to the vanishing point. And once you connect the corners, now what you're going to do is you're going to cut out the shape of the cube that you're trying to draw. So let's find the edge of the cube. Now there's the vertical edge and there's the horizontal edge. Okay, and once we set this out, we can trace the cube over, and look at that. You have a cube in three-dimensional space. And what's cool about this is you don't have to put it under the horizon line. You can put it on top of the horizon line. You can put it like pretty much anywhere you want on the page. And here is another cube, right? Same logic, following the same steps. And you can do this basically anywhere on the page. And here I am playing around with some floating cubes. And you can also do different shapes, like a triangle or a cylinder. So this is it. This is 1-point perspective. Now moving on to 2-point perspective. And it's all in the name. 2-point means 2 vanishing points. So we're going to do a horizon line again, and we're going to put down 2 separate points. So here's point number 1 and point number 2. Once you have the 2 points down, now you can find the middle edge of the cube that you're going to draw. So here is my edge. And what you're going to do is connect each end of the yeah, you have to be able to connect it. So there you go, connect it. And I can't draw a straight line apparently, but yeah, connect the ends of the line, the middle line, to your vanishing points. And now when you have this, figure out where you're going to cut out the cube. So here's this another vertical line where I'm going to determine is the edge of the cube. And once I set this line, I'm going to connect the ends, the tops of these lines, back to the vanishing points, and they're going to be connecting to the opposite vanishing points, right? So now once we trace this shape out, look at that, we have a cube. We can erase the exterior lines, the grid that we were basing this off of, and look at that, that's a cube in 2-point perspective. And I'm going to do a second one on top of the horizon line. So this one is going to look like it's floating, and it's basically the same logic as the first one. Find the middle edge and then find the outer edges, and then connect the edges to the opposite vanishing points. And once you have that, you can trace the shape out, and look at that, you have a floating cube, and that is 2-point perspective. So now moving on to 3-point perspective, and it's exactly as the name says, it's 3 vanishing points. And it's not going to be as hard as it seems. So we're going to start again with a horizon line and 2 vanishing points, and we're going to find the edge of the cube that we're going to draw. Okay, and once you do this, it's pretty much the same process as you would do for a 2-point perspective. So you would connect the ends of this line back to the vanishing points, and then you would find the edge of the cube, so the outer edges of the cube, and I'm just going to mark them right there, and I'm connecting them back to the opposite vanishing points. But what's going to be different is we're going to add a 3rd vanishing point to the bottom. Okay, and what this is going to do is we're going to be connecting the outer edges of the cube back down to this vanishing point. And same thing, we're going to just trace over the outlines of the cube, and now you can see it's really coming together. It's looking like a very exaggerated perspective. And I'm just gonna show you guys where you might be able to use 3-point perspective. Okay, so here is gonna be a little city scene, and we're looking at it from the sky, top down. And here's building number 1. Notice how I'm following the 3-point perspective grid loosely, but I'm still following it. And there's building number 2, building number 3 right there, and we're gonna put a little street at the bottom, and Spider-Man swinging from the sky. So there is my Spider-Man. That is the best I can do. And he is swinging from a web down into the city. Okay, and now you too can draw Spider-Man. And demonstration number 2, I'm going to do a 1-point perspective. I'm going to be applying this to a little train yard scene or a train station scene. So here is going to be the front of the train. Okay, I'm drawing the front of the train, and notice how I put down the perspective grid first, because it's important to know the angles of all the edges that you're going to be drawing. And what's really interesting is if you look at the spaces between these grid lines, you're going to see that as they get closer to you, the spaces also get bigger and things get smaller as they get further away. So this is like the same logic in real life, right? If you're looking at something close to you, it's going to be way bigger than if it were farther away. So this is a good thing to keep in mind. This is important because we're drawing on a two-dimensional surface. We're not able to actually convey real depth. So we have to keep in mind the things that make things look like they're in three-dimensional space and lie to our audiences and make them think that our drawings are three-dimensional when they're actually not. And take note of the windows on this train. I'm also following the perspective lines for them as well. So you want to make sure that every detail you put on your object is following the same perspective grid as your actual object. Okay, so now moving on to the right side, I'm going to demonstrate some common mistakes that I see a lot of people make that make their perspective look a little bit off. Okay, so here I'm doing another train, and we're going to do a perspective grid here. So that's the correct perspective grid, but I'm going to show you what happens when you don't follow it. So here is the exterior line of the train. Look at that. It's like completely off the grid now, and it almost looks like the train is turning. Now if that's what you're going for, great, but we want the train to look like it's sitting on the same track as the one on the left, right? So here is an even worse example. This is like, oh my goodness, what are you doing? And I'm going to set up a scene here with the station in the back, so you can see that just how out of place this train looks now because of that angle on the top, right? So let's erase that and let's change it back to the correct angle, following back to the vanishing point. And look at that, as soon as we do this, we have a scene with a correct perspective, and it looks like we're actually there. So this is Perspective 101, guys. I hope you've been educated, and thank you for watching.
Quite a common problem we can find ourselves in is that we can watch a teaching video and it makes absolute sense while we're watching it and we can understand it. But when we go from there to what for us is a real life situation, sometimes what seems so obvious in the teaching video is not so easy to apply in real life. And perspective is probably the most confusing subject in drawing streetscapes. 1, 2, and 3-point perspective videos are all over the place on YouTube, which shows what an issue they can be for people. I've got 3 videos myself, 1 on each of them. Hey, if you haven't watched them, I think they're worth a look. But this video is particularly for people who've watched those videos, but still you're not really sure when you go to draw something, how does that apply to this? Which one of those videos applies to either the scene in front of me that I'm drawing, if at all, or the scene I want to create from my imagination? If I'm copying a scene, either from life or from a reference, then in one sense, I really have to see what I'm looking at and just draw it accurately. I don't really need to understand anything of a theoretical framework. And if I draw accurately, it will look right. But in my experience, if I understand what I'm meant to be seeing, it's easier to see what's really there and therefore easier to draw it more accurately. And of course, if I'm creating a scene from my imagination, even a 3-dimensional landscape, say for a game, where the viewpoint changes continuously, then I actually have nothing to copy from. And it's even more important to understand how these perspective principles work. My aim is that this video will help equip you to understand the situations where 1, 2, or 3-point perspective apply. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you've subscribed to my channel, thanks. If you haven't and you've watched some of them and you think they're helpful, then please subscribe, please hit notifications, please comment, please do all the things that you know help grow a channel. I'd really appreciate that. So we'll start with 1-point perspective. When we talk about 1-point, 2-point, 3-point perspective, the point refers to the vanishing point, the number of vanishing points that a certain view of a certain object will create. Therefore, in 1-point perspective, there is one vanishing point. The other thing we need to understand is that the vanishing point sits on the eye level. And the eye level is the level of our eyes as we're viewing the object, or the level of the camera. So in this case, this is the point where the camera was being held. And the reason why it is 1 point perspective is because when we stand front onto an object, or almost front onto an object, then we pretty much see the front face of the object without any change, and the angles of the lines at right angles all meet at a certain point on eye level. This is also a 1 point perspective, where it's this roadway, which is the object we're directly in front of, but where in effect the fronts of these objects we're still looking at front on without any distortion. All of these objects are in 1 point perspective, even though for one of them we're looking directly square on to it. For others, we're looking square on but down, others square on and up, others square on but from the right, or others square on and up and from the left. Because from this viewing point of these objects, there is only 1 point that all of these lines go back to. One vanishing point. So we need to look out for 1 point perspective when we're looking straight on at an object. Here's part of the Kelvin Grove Museum and Gallery in Glasgow. This perspective reflects this, in that we're not exactly in front of it, we're slightly to the side, and we can see there is a very slight perspective view of the side. If we were to stand back a bit and see more of the building, then at some point we would see none of this, and then if we kept moving to the right, we would start to see something similar to this, but on the left-hand side of the front-facing wall. Here we have the sort of example which relates back to this perspective model, except often with a building, this face is a wall and we can't see inside of it. In this case, because this is an open arcade, we can in fact see these lines as our theory tells us they're going to be there. So this model is also applicable if we're in an interior space against one wall parallel to the opposite wall. Our third example is a good example of how simple theory diagrams actually don't always apply in real life. Basically, this is a 1 point perspective view. We're in the center looking up a street and we have buildings on both sides who have perspective lines coming down. But this sort of perspective diagram always assumes that the ground is flat. And in this scene, we can see that the ground does slope up, more so on the left side than the right side. As well as that, it widens around this building, which means that these buildings here are not on the same plane, they're not on the same straight line as these buildings here. This line here is not dead straight. Further at the end of the street, as the street turns around, that again distorts this line and this line being straight. However, with this building here, where 2 point perspective is probably the perspective most people are thinking of when they hear the phrase perspective. It's where we have two vanishing points on our eye level. And we get 2 point perspective when we're not standing front on looking at an object, but we're standing looking at it from an angle. And so each side has its own vanishing point. In its simplest form, it's a box. So here we have a building and we're looking at it at an angle. And we're standing pretty much straight onto this side. And because this is a right angle street, hidden a little bit by the fact that it goes uphill on the left here, we're facing these side walls at pretty much the same angle. And because of that, the perspective angles are very similar. However, if my example is more like this diagram, where one wall is moving away from us more than the other, it will have a greater angle here and here than on the side where we're a little closer to being front on. So here's an example of that. Here we have the corner. And we can see actually more easily here than in the diagram that this wall is moving away from us as we go along the wall at a much faster rate than this wall, which even though it does still move further away from us as you move along, it doesn't move as far. And therefore this angle is a steeper angle than that one. And the same applies at the lower end. This angle is not as steep as this one. And this is a really important concept to get, because if when we're drawing we make this angle or this angle too steep, in effect we push the building further away from us more quickly than is in real life. Of course, buildings don't have to be a box. Many buildings are in effect a series of boxes attached to each other in various ways. But we still have our principle that all the vertical lines at their corners go back to one of two vanishing points on eye level. This building is a good example of that. Off to the right, the angles of perspective are quite shallow because we're more front on to this long side. Off to the left, the angles are steeper because this side of the building is sloping away at a steeper angle than this side. And of course, this wall and this wall and this wall all line up with the vanishing point for this wall. One important point to note is that in these three examples, eye level is quite low. Here, because this ground is flat, eye level is actually the eye level of the people. So eye level is relatively very close to the bottom of the building. Eye level is here in this example. That may look too low for the building, but what that means is that I was standing on a lower level than the base of this building. Eye level is where horizontal lines appear straight, regardless of which side or part of a building they're on. Eye level is low down. It is disguised a bit side by the fact that this is a sloping street. But I have a video that's particularly to do with perspective on uphill sloping streets. So we'll finish 2-point perspective by looking at this example where eye level is very high in the building. In fact, eye level is about here. And it can be this high because I was in an upper floor of the Louvre taking this photo through a window. And this is also a good example of how if we're more front on in 2-point perspective, the angle is shallow. If a side of a building slopes away from us more steeply, then the perspective angles will be greater. In this case, almost all the perspective angles are under eye level, but the rules still apply. Again, with 2-point perspective, it's based on the assumption that the streets are straight, that the buildings all line up on the same level, and that the ground is consistently flat. Finally, we'll look at possibly the trickiest of all, and that's 3-point perspective. And there's a few things to consider with that. This is probably the most typical 3-point perspective image that we see. Here we have a spire of a church. In 3-point perspective, we have our normal 2-point perspective. So we have one vanishing point off to the left, one vanishing point off to the right, but we can see from the shape of the spire that there's another in 3-point point off the shape of the spire that there's another vanishing point above. Although the center line is straight, the side lines angle up, and that if you were to continue them, they would meet at some point, and that's the third vanishing point. And while we have an eye level on the horizontal plane, which is actually below the level of this photo, we also have a vertical eye level. And it's on this line that our vertical perspective lines will meet. Just as horizontal eye level is at the level of my eyes as I stand looking at something, vertical eye level is directly in front of my eyes. But we do need to be careful with photo references because if they've been cropped, then a true vertical is a view of the same tower, but from further back, and so the vertical perspective isn't really apparent. And that's the other point about vertical perspective. We get it with something very tall when we are very close to it. And so it has a sense of looking up or looking down. The taller it is, the further away we can be and still have a sense of this angling to a point. Here's a simpler view where we're looking straight onto the building. We're not looking at it at an angle as in our spire example. The vertical eye level is our one true vertical line, and the perspective lines as they move away from it angle more and more in exactly the same way as they do in 2-point perspective on one side, where we have eye level And as the perspective lines move further away above and below eye level, the angle increases. The other thing just to notice quickly is that just as we have foreshortening in perspective, which is the visual compression of what we're seeing as it moves further away from us, exactly the same thing happens on the vertical. Vertical perspective foreshortening means that as we look up a skyscraper, windows that are all the same size appear compressed as they get further away. Vertical perspective happens on buildings as we look up, but we also see it on buildings if we're up high looking down. As in the case in this Sydney skyscraper. And remember, we see this effect when we're relatively close and low down to a tall structure. If we move higher up and further away, then our perspective vertical lines become vertical again. Vertical perspective happens inside a building as well as outside. And so if we're drawing this effect, we need to make sure we angle our lines increasingly. But we also get this effect when we're looking down in an internal space as well. Exactly the same as with an exterior view in 3-point perspective. And so we have our 1 point of perspective down here, we have 1 point going off to the left, and we have another point coming off to our right. Sometimes we're very high looking down, and so horizontal eye level is actually above everything in our view. But it's the same principle. We find the vertical eye level, and on that line, our 3rd point perspective will meet. And of course, we can see that our 1st and 2nd point perspective lines will meet on horizontal eye level, in this case, quite some distance to the right. Invariably, if we use a camera to take a photo, the camera exaggerates the vertical perspective angles. And so we see this leaning in towards the center.
Wait, what? So, hmm. Wait. How the
In situations where
It's 3, and do a 1-point perspective. I'm going to be applying this to a little train yard scene, or connect the edges to the opposite vanishing points. And once you have that,
Holy fuck. Wait. Está bien. Sería. mm, se- Sería